The cruel tongues of Pine Ridge whispered about Emma Rose, calling her the childless woman who delivered babies for others. Everything changed when the widowed cattle baron invited her to care for his young ones. Emma Rose had grown up in the dusty settlement of Pine Ridge, Colorado Territory. During the harsh winter of 1879, the December wind howled through the mountain passes, stirring up clouds of grit along Pine Ridge's single thoroughfare. Cartwheels clattered against frozen ruts, and the painted board outside Henderson's Mercantile groaned against its chains. The aroma of camphor and sage wafted through the partially opened entrance. Emma pulled her woolen cloak tighter as she entered, her leather boots clicking against the weathered planks. She approached the merchant's counter with a carefully written inventory of healing plants, clutched in her palm remedies needed for an expectant mother living in the distant foothills, whose time was near and complications had already begun. Establishment hummed quietly with the sound of rustling packages and clinking glass containers, until two ladies near the shelving spoke with deliberate volume. "Look who just entered," the first woman announced, her tone carrying like a bell. Tower chime. The baby catcher who never bore one herself. Her companion snickered, casting a sideways glance at Emma. A birth attendant without offspring? Perhaps if she'd experienced motherhood herself, she'd understand more than plants and blade work. Emma kept her focus on the containers of dried chamomile and mint leaves, maintaining steady hands despite her fingers gripping the list more tightly. The first speaker raised her voice further. Sensible folks would keep their infants away from her touch. Lord protect any child she handles. Emma's chest constricted, but she controlled her breathing. She'd endured far worse gossip before. From behind her, the door creaked open. Heavy spurs rang across the floor as a broad-shouldered rancher approached the counter beside her. His face bore the marks of outdoor living, his hat dusted with snow, eyes the shade of autumn grain. Before Emma could turn, a lanky man by the heating stove called out mockingly, "Well, look, here it's the infant doctor who never birthed one. If you're such an expert at bringing them earthward, why haven't you managed one for yourself?" Several men chuckled at this. Emma faced him directly, her voice controlled and quiet. "You're blocking my path, sir. Please step away." Before the man could respond, the rancher's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "That's sufficient." His gaze locked onto the jeering man, his hand resting casually near his pistol grip. "She's preserved more lives than every person in this building combined. If you have grievances, take them outdoors and keep moving until you locate someone." Interested in listening? The store fell silent. The mocker muttered and shuffled aside. The rancher touched his hat brim respectfully. "Jake Morrison. I operate the Morrison spread beyond Willow Creek." "I know the location," Emma replied. Jake moved to the counter, placing silver coins down. "Include her purchases with mine." "That's unnecessary," Emma began. "It is," Jake said more softly. "My son's been wheezing for nearly a week. My daughter requires more care than I can provide alone. You'd be helping me, and I'd rather have you away from the foolish talk of people like these." His expression remained steady, without condescension. Emma considered declining, but thoughts of her patient in the foothills and two motherless children swayed her decision. "I'll come," she agreed. Jake gathered the parcels and handed them to her. "Then let's depart before someone decides to resume their chatter." The cold mountain air caught the door behind them, slamming it shut on the hushed store. Inside, nobody spoke. Outside, the sign creaked overhead, but for the first time in many days. The burden of the town's gossip felt slightly diminished. Journey from town passed quietly, marked only by the sound of leather creaking and occasional whinnies from Jake's stallion. Emma gazed toward the horizon where golden meadows rolled into aspen groves, the air carrying hints of dried grass and chimney smoke. When the ranch appeared, it exceeded her expectations. 3 barns, an expansive paddock, a solid log house with a veranda extending like welcoming arms. Fencing stretched toward the mountains, livestock grazing in the distance. Jake dismounted first. "Welcome to Morrison Ranch," he said, gesturing toward the porch where 2 small figures waited. Thomas, approximately 7 years old, with unruly hair and a wrinkled shirt, stood beside Lucy, barely 4, clinging to his sleeve. Both were shoeless, faces streaked with dirt. "This is Miss Rose," Jake announced. "She'll be staying temporarily." Thomas's expression remained cautious and evaluating. Lucy hid behind her brother, peeking out only when Emma offered a gentle smile. "Hello," Emma said kindly. "I understand you to keep your father quite occupied." Thomas's mouth twitched, but suppressed a grin. Lucy simply gripped her brother tighter. The house interior was cozy, but showed signs of a man managing alone. Boots by the entrance, plates stacked, the fire burning low. "I wasn't certain how long you'd remain," Jake said, guiding her down the corridor. "But I prepared the guest room." Emma paused at the threshold. The room was modest, but bright, with a handmade quilt folded at the bed's end. On the side table, a pottery vase held wildflowers in brilliant oranges and purples. In the corner sat a weathered wooden rocker. "My wife used to rest there," Jake said quietly. "Thought you might appreciate it for quiet moments." She turned toward him, but he was already looking elsewhere. "Thank you," she said softly. The room felt like more than temporary lodging. It felt like an invitation. That evening, Emma unpacked her modest traveling bag, arranging her worn medical supplies on the dresser. She had intended to stay only briefly to tend Jake's children, but as she worked in the kitchen later, preparing a modest dinner, she could sense the loneliness in the house, the kind that sturdy timber couldn't conceal. After supper, Lucy climbed into the rocking chair, tracing the armrests with tiny fingers. "Mother used to sit here," she whispered. "I'm certain she was very gentle," Emma said, her heart tightening. Thomas, clearing plates without being asked, looked up. "She was, but she's been gone a long while now." Jake returned from the barn, his coat carrying the night's chill. His eyes moved from his children to Emma, then to the chair, and he gave a small nod, as if confirming she belonged in the right place. Later, with the children asleep, Emma stepped onto the veranda. The plains stretched under a star-filled sky, the air sharp with juniper. She remembered another porch, another home, before illness claimed her husband. And before that winter evening, when her infant arrived too early to survive, she had buried. Both within days, her heart sealing over like a wound that refused to heal. From then on, she had delivered other women's babies, never allowing herself to belong to any family again. But tonight, hearing the faint creaking of the rocking chair inside and seeing the wildflowers on the table, she felt something she hadn't permitted in years, an unspoken welcome. And for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, she didn't resist. The gossip spread swiftly. By the end of her first week at Morrison Ranch, Emma could feel the whispers like a draft beneath a sealed door, seeping in despite how tightly she wrapped herself in her duties. At the Mercantile, two men paused. Their conversation as she entered, their eyes shifting from her to the sack of grain in her arms. In the churchyard on Sunday, the minister's wife smiled politely, but Emma caught the quick glance toward another woman, the subtle shake of disapproval. In the tavern, the talk was less refined. "Jake Morrison's got that childless midwife playing." "Homemaker out there?" a cowhand said over his whiskey. "Wouldn't shock me if she's after his property," another replied, drawing laughter from nearby listeners. Even at the pharmacy, where she came only for supplies, Emma felt it the weight of eyes following her, judging every movement. She kept her chin raised, her voice steady with the shopkeeper. But by the time she reached her wagon, her jaw ached from holding it firm. One evening, after a long day tending to Thomas's cough and Lucy's scraped elbow, Emma stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark yard. The wind pushed dry snow across the porch, whispering against the walls. She didn't see the figures moving in the shadows beyond the barn. Garrett did. Garrett was a thick-set man with a scar running from his forehead to his chin, the kind who made his living where law arrived slowly, if at all. He and three others moved like they owned the darkness, slipping toward the side entrance. Inside the barn, Jake was completing the evening chores. He heard the crunch of boots on frozen ground where no boots should be. Pulling off his gloves, he stepped into the space between barn and corral. "Evening, Garrett," Jake said, his voice low but carrying. The large man stopped, his companions spreading out just enough to form a wall. "We're here for a word with your house guest," Garrett replied, his tone slick. She's resting, Jake said. I don't welcome folks skulking around my property after dark. Garrett grinned without warmth. Best for her to leave before folks get more upset. Ain't good for a man standing keeping company like that. Jake stepped forward until barely a yard separated them. The lamplight from the barn caught the steel in his eyes. My standing is my own business, but you and your boys. He glanced toward the corral, where a gate hung open, the wind swinging. It just enough to reveal a length of braided rope looped over the post. You've been careless tonight. One of the younger men shifted uneasily. You came to frighten her, Jake continued, his voice quiet. But I reckon you'd rather I not ride into town tomorrow and tell the sheriff whose boot tracks I found by my barn. Tracks I can follow straight to the boarding house where you're staying. Garrett's smirk wavered. Jake didn't need to raise his voice. He just let the silence stretch until the cold seemed to penetrate deeper. Now, Jake said, tilting his head toward the road, you can walk away and reconsider your choices, or you can stay. And I'll make sure every ranch within 50 miles hears how you tried to sneak into a man's home after his children were asleep. No. One moved for a long breath. Then Garrett spat into the snow. Come on, he muttered, turning away. The others followed, boots crunching until the sound faded into the night. Jake watched until they disappeared, then secured the barn door, sliding the bolt into place. He walked the house perimeter once, checking the latches, ensuring the shutters were secure. Inside, Emma was in the small parlor, a book open in her lap. She looked up as he entered. Finished in the barn? Jake nodded, removing his coat. All done. He didn't mention Garrett, or the open gate, or the rope. There was no need to trouble her with it. Instead, he added another log to the fire and made a mental note to oil the porch door hinges in the morning. From her chair, Emma watched the flames catch, unaware of the cold danger that had brushed past her window, and of the quiet line Jake had drawn in the darkness to keep it from crossing her threshold. The path to the truth wasn't long. Jake found it in the same place most gossip in Pine Ridge originated, over a bottle in the saloon. He stood at the far end of the bar, hat low, listening while two ranch hands exchanged news they shouldn't have spoken aloud. Told Garrett he'd get good pay if that midwife packed her bags, one said, chuckling. Yeah, wealthiest family in the territory. Old. Man Sterling wants his daughter settled at Morrison Ranch, says it's time Jake had a suitable woman under his roof. Jake let the words sink in. So that was it. Garrett was merely a hired threat, a piece in someone else's game. The next morning, Jake visited Sheriff Clayton. The two men sat in the back office, a single lamp burning, frost thick on the window. Pains. I want them caught where everyone can witness it, Jake said. Clayton leaned back, chewing a pencil end. That means we make it public, but it has to appear genuine, Jake. It will, Jake replied. I just need you and your deputy ready to step in after I take the bite out of it. They set the plan in motion. 3 days later, word spread that Emma Rose would be in town to gather medical supplies for the winter births. The news traveled faster than it should have, exactly as Jake intended. On the appointed morning, Emma walked the boardwalk toward Henderson's Mercantile, unaware she carried bait simply by being there. Jake lingered near the blacksmith shop, his eyes tracking every movement in the street. The sheriff leaned against the post outside his office, pretending to roll a cigarette. Garrett appeared from the far end of the street, his long coat swinging with each step. Two of his men flanked him, hands loose near their gun belts. They spread out just enough to push passers-by to the street edges. Jake's heartbeat slowed, his breathing even. He watched Garrett's eyes fix on Emma's back. The big man called out, voice carrying over the winter air. Hey, midwife. Emma froze, half turning. Miss, you got a bad habit of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, Garrett said, stepping closer. Some folks think maybe you need reminding to leave before worse comes along. His hand dropped to his revolver. The street went still. Jake moved. He stepped from the blacksmith's doorway in one fluid motion, his own Colt clearing leather, almost before the thought had formed. The crack of the shot split the silence, echoing off the wooden storefronts. Garrett's revolver flew from his hand, spinning into the snow with a dull thud. The big man clutched his wrist, swearing. Jake's voice was calm, almost cold. "That's enough." Every face in the street was turned toward them, now shopkeepers in doorways, women clutching baskets, cowhands frozen mid-step. "You draw on her again," Jake went on, "and next time I won't aim for the gun." Sheriff Clayton strode forward. Then, his badge catching the pale sun. "Garrett, you and your boys just bought yourselves a trip to the jail? Seems you've been making trouble for hire, and I've got witnesses to prove it." The deputies moved in, binding Garrett's hands and marching the men away. Jake turned to Emma. "You all right?" She nodded slowly, still staring at the revolver half buried in snow. "I think so." He tipped his hat, his gaze steady on hers. "Then let's get your supplies and head home." As they walked toward the mercantile, the murmurs began. Not the sharp-edged whispers Emma had grown used to, but a different kind of talk. She caught fragments. "Never seen shooting that clean. Stood up for her. Guess she's not what folks were saying." For the first time since she'd set foot in Pine Ridge, the eyes on her felt less like judgment and more like something else, something closer to respect. Behind them, the snow in the street still held the imprint of Garrett's revolver, a silent marker of the moment the tide had begun to turn. The snow had been falling since morning, heavy flakes drifting down from a sky the color of pewter. By nightfall, the drifts lay deep against the porch rails, and the wind howled across the open prairie. Inside, the house was warm, but a different kind of chill had settled over it. Lucy was sick. It had started with a cough 2 days ago. Small, sharp, nothing that had seemed too concerning at first. But by evening, her little chest worked harder for each breath, her cheeks flushed with fever. Now she lay curled beneath the quilts, sweat beading along her brow, her lips dry and pale. Jake hovered near the bed, his large hands useless against the heat radiating from his daughter's small frame. "The snow's too deep to ride for the doctor," he said, voice rough. Emma had already set her bag on the table and was sorting through jars and cloths. "Then we do what we can here," she answered, calm but quick. "Get me clean water and stoke the fire. She needs warmth, but not too much heat." Thomas stood in the doorway, eyes wide, clutching the doorframe. "Is Lucy going to be all right?" Emma turned to him, her tone steady. "She will if we work together. Fetch more kindling and stay close." The long hours of the night, Emma worked without pause. She brewed infusions from dried willow bark and yarrow, the steam carrying the bitter scent through the room. She cooled cloths in a basin, laying them against Lucy's forehead, then replaced them before the heat could build again. When Lucy's breathing grew to shallow, Emma lifted her gently, holding her upright to ease the strain on her lungs. She rubbed the girl's back in slow circles, murmuring soft words that were more rhythm than meaning. Jake brought water and more wood, then sat helplessly in the chair beside the bed. "I've buried enough family," he said hoarsely. "Can't, you won't." Emma cut in firmly. "Not tonight." The hours dragged. Outside, the wind battered the walls. But inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the clink of spoons against glass, and Lucy's ragged breaths. Near midnight, the fever spiked. Lucy whimpered, twisting weakly against the covers. Emma soaked a fresh cloth and pressed it to the girl's neck, her own pulse quickening. She had seen too many children lose this fight, and the memory of her own baby Tiny, fragile, slipping away in her arms, threatened to break her focus. She forced it back, keeping her hands steady. "Stay with me, little one," she whispered. "You're not going anywhere." Jake shifted beside her, his hand brushing the edge of the blanket. "Tell me what to do. Keep the water fresh," she said, "and talk to her. She knows your voice." So he did. He told Lucy about the spring calves, about the mare that would foal soon, about the creek thawing and the flowers she liked to pick. His voice was low and steady, filling the space between the storms of coughing. The night wore on, measured doses carefully, coaxing Lucy to swallow small sips. She placed her hand against the girl's chest, feeling for each breath, willing them to keep coming. Just before dawn, something shifted. The tight, shallow gasps eased into slower, deeper breaths. The fever's heat began to fade, replaced by a damp coolness against Emma's palm. She sat back, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "She's past the worst," she said softly. Jake's head lifted, eyes searching her face. "You sure?" Emma nodded. "She's out of danger now. She'll need rest, but she's going to be all right." Jake's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. He looked at his daughter, then back at Emma. In the dim light of the fire, his eyes shone, red-rimmed, raw with relief. "Thank you," he said, the words rough, as if they had to push past something heavy in his chest. Emma brushed a strand of hair from Lucy's damp forehead. "She's a strong one. Ah, you've raised her well." But when she glanced up, Jake was still watching her, not just with gratitude, but with something deeper, something unspoken that lingered even after the storm outside began to fade. The days that followed brought a quiet change too. The rhythm of the house. Thomas, once guarded and watchful, began to seek Emma out, not with questions about chores or lessons, but with stories of the things that mattered to him. He told her about the hidden spot by the creek where wild raspberries grew, about the time he and his father rescued a calf caught in the mud, and about how he sometimes still dreamed of his mother. She listened without rushing him, never prying, letting him set the pace. Lucy, too, grew bolder. Most nights she would climb into Emma's lap after supper, head resting against her chest, her small body relaxing in a way that spoke of safety and trust. Sometimes she fell asleep there, the faint rise and fall of her breathing keeping time. With the crackle of the fire, Jake noticed. He noticed the way Thomas laughed more easily, the way Lucy hummed as she played, the way the air in the house felt warmer, even when the wind was sharp outside. And he noticed, too, the way Emma fit into their lives without forcing her place, how she moved through the kitchen, the barn, the fields, as though she had always belonged. One evening they sat down to a meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread. It was nothing fancy, but the table was full, and so was the sound of conversation. Jake caught himself smiling, the kind of smile that came without thinking. Halfway through the meal, the sound of hooves crunching on frozen earth broke. Through the easy talk, Jake's smile faded. He rose and stepped to the window. 2 wagons had pulled up outside. A group of well-dressed men and women were climbing down. At their center stood Mr. Sterling, tall, silver-haired, and carrying himself like a man used to getting what he wanted. His daughter, Victoria Sterling, followed behind, her gloved hands folded neatly, eyes scanning the house with quiet calculation. Jake opened the door before they could knock. "Evening," he said flatly. Sterling tipped his hat. "Evening, Jake. We thought we might have a word." Inside, Emma had gathered Lucy into her arms, Thomas standing close beside her. Sterling stepped forward. "We hear you've taken in a guest. While I'm sure her intentions are good. There are those in town who believe a more fitting arrangement would benefit your family." He gestured toward Victoria. "My daughter is prepared to help raise your children, manage your home, and see to the ranch's affairs." Jake's jaw tightened. "You're here to tell me who belongs in my home?" Sterling's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here to offer you a choice that will spare you a good deal of trouble." Jake's gaze moved from Sterling to Victoria, then back again. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "The only trouble I see is a man thinking he has the right to decide my family for me." Victoria Sterling's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think keeping a midwife with no ties, no family, is better for your children than giving them a mother who she is their mother?" Jake said, cutting her off. The words hung in the air, clear and solid as the winter sky. Behind him, Emma's breath caught. Jake stepped forward, closing the space between himself and Sterling. "The woman in that room is part of my family. She has earned her place here in ways that have nothing to do with your standards or your daughter's ambitions. Whatever business you thought you came here for ends now." For a moment, no one moved. Then Sterling's expression shifted, the charm slipping from his face. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the wagon. Victoria followed her, chin high, but her steps quick. Jake watched them go, the cold air sharp against his skin. When he stepped back inside, Thomas was grinning openly, and Lucy still clung to Emma's neck. Emma met Jake's eyes. Something unspoken passing between them. A shared understanding that whatever storms the town might send their way, the walls of this house would hold. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the mingled scents of wood smoke and apple cider. Lanterns swung from the eaves of storefronts, casting warm light over the crowded main street. The harvest festival had drawn nearly every soul from Pine Ridge ranchers in their Sunday coats. Children darting between stalls, the church choir, singing near the gazebo. Emma walked beside Jake, her hands tucked into her shawl, still unused to the easy glances and nods she now received. Since the trouble with Garrett and the Sterlings, the sharp whispers had faded, replaced with something quieter, almost curious. Still, she hadn't expected Jake to bring her here tonight. They stopped near the center of the street where the townfolk gathered between the bandstand and the general store. Music drifted on the air, and laughter rippled through the crowd. Then Jake turned to her, his eyes steady. "Stay here a moment," he said, and stepped up onto the low platform beside the bandstand. The conversations around them dimmed, people turning to see the tall rancher standing in the lamplight. "Evening, folks," Jake began, his voice carrying without strain. "I won't take much of your time, but there's something I need to say where everyone can hear it." Emma felt a flutter of unease. She stood rooted, the eyes of half the town now glancing between her and the man on the platform. Jake reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out a small worn box. He opened it, and inside lay a gold ring, simple but elegant. The band softened. "By years of wear? My grandmother wore this ring for most of her life," Jake said, his voice steady but warm. "She told me once that it wasn't the gold that mattered, it was what it stood for. Family, loyalty, the promise to stand by each other through every hard season." His gaze swept the crowd, then found Emma's. "I've been fortunate in my life, but I've also lost more than I ever wanted to. And I know there's been talk about the woman who came to my ranch about whether she belongs there. I'm telling you now, she does, more than anyone could understand from the outside looking in." He stepped down from the platform and crossed. To her, the crowd parting silently. Stopping before her, he held the ring between them. "Emma Rose," he said, his voice low enough for her alone at first, then rising so all could hear. "My grandmother's ring is the one thing I never thought I would give away. But tonight, I'm giving it to the woman I trust to keep my family whole." For a long moment, the only sound was the faint creak of a lantern swaying overhead. Emma felt the weight of every gaze in the street, but more than that. She felt the weight of Jake's words, solid, unshaken. Her hand trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as though it had been made for her. Jake's eyes didn't leave. Hers, "You've stood with me through more than I had any right to ask. Now I'm asking you to stay in it because my children need you, but because I do." Somewhere in the crowd, someone let out a soft sigh. Another person cleared their throat. Then silence swept over the street again, deep and absolute. Emma felt her throat tighten, but she managed a nod. "I will," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But somehow it carried. Jake's mouth curved into the smallest of smiles before he turned, keeping her hand in his, to face the crowd. "This is my family," he said simply. No one spoke against it. A few hats tipped in quiet respect. Someone near the bandstand began clapping, slow at first, then joined by others until the sound rolled through the street like distant thunder. Emma stood there with the ring warm against her skin, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. For the first time since she'd come to Pine Ridge, she didn't feel like she was standing on borrowed ground. The spring sun spilled gold across Morrison Ranch, setting the creek aglow and brightening fields dotted with wildflowers. Chairs stood beneath the old cottonwood near the barn, plain but adorned with garlands of fresh blooms. Friends from town, neighboring ranchers, and the sheriff spoke quietly, their voices drifting on the warm breeze. Inside, Emma stood before her small mirror, smoothing the skirt of her ivory-colored dress-soft cotton with a touch of lace. It felt right. For a moment, the woman staring back at her seemed far removed from the newcomer, who had once stepped into Pine Ridge. A knock came. Thomas peeked in. "Ready, Mama?" The word still caught her. She smiled. "I am." He offered his arm with solemn pride. "Then let's go." They stepped outside into sunlight. Lucy, in a pale blue dress, skipped ahead, scattering petals from a small basket, her laughter bright as morning. Thomas matched Emma's pace, leading her toward Jake beneath the cottonwood. Jake stood tall in his best shirt and dark vest, hat in hand. When their eyes met, his faint smile told her everything. The ceremony was simple. The pastor spoke of commitment through seasons, how the land endured winter, trusting in spring. Emma heard the words, but her gaze stayed on Jake, on how his eyes never left hers. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed her with quiet reverence, and the world seemed to fade. Applause broke out, hats lifted, and the children ran forward.
Wow.
Lucy clung to Emma's waist. Thomas grinned up at them, pride shining. Later, when chairs were cleared and the sun sank toward the hills, Emma and Jake stood on the porch watching. The last guests ride off. The air smelled of cut hay and honeysuckle. Jake stepped closer, resting his hand on her shoulder. His thumb brushed the fabrics, small, almost unconscious, yet full of meaning. Gratitude, trust, love, unspoken. She met his gaze. It was the same steady look he'd given the night he faced down Garrett. The same when he'd placed his grandmother's ring on her finger. In the quiet, she felt the truth of her journey. She thought of the words once whispered behind her back. Childless. Midwife. Then she thought of Thomas's hand on her arm, Lucy's laughter, Jake's touch.